I don't have one.
I couldn't live without movies. One of them I'll never forget. Kiss of the Spider Woman.
On the surface, Kiss of the Spider Woman sounds like a dangerous balancing act. A prison drama set against the brutal political reality of Argentina in the early 1980s. A story about loneliness, repression, state violence, and the fragile alliance between two men thrown together in a cell. And at the exact same time, a lush, old-school musical fantasy in which Jennifer Lopez appears as the dazzling Ingrid Luna in the intoxicating screen creation known as the Spider Woman. Those elements should clash. In the wrong hands, they would clash. One side would feel too severe, the other too artificial. But Bill Condon understands something essential here. The fantasy is not decoration. It is survival. Luis Molina, played by Tonatiuh, is not just escaping into a favorite movie because he is whimsical or naive. He is clinging to it because the imagination is the only place where he can breathe without permission. That distinction matters. Molina is a gay window dresser imprisoned for public indecency, and inside the cell he shares with political prisoner Valentin Aragui, played by Diego Luna, fantasy becomes both shield and language. He narrates the film inside his head. He retells it. He beautifies it. He keeps it alive. And in doing so, he refuses to let the cell become the full definition of his inner life. Valentin, of course, begins as the opposite. He is focused on material reality, political purpose, bodily suffering, and the immediate cruelty of the world around them. To him, Molina's devotion to this movie initially feels frivolous at best and pathetic at worst. That friction is exactly what gives the story its weight. One man survives through imagination. The other survives through discipline. One reaches upward toward glitter, romance, and illusion. The other keeps digging downward into structure, oppression, and resistance. The film is at its best when those two survival systems stop, mocking each other and start revealing how incomplete each one is on its own. That is where the movie really comes alive, because the prison story is not merely interrupted by the musical material, it is transformed by it. The fantasy sequences do not just offer contrast, they gradually become a mirror. As Molina retells the story of Aurora and the Spider Woman, the emotional shapes of that film begin bending back toward the lives of the men in the cell. Longing, fear, denial, performance, surrender, and the cost of love all start rhyming across the two worlds. Bill Condon has always been good at this sort of tension between image and ache, between theatricality and pain. Chicago remains the most obvious comparison because there too he understood that spectacle could function as psychological translation. Here, the same instinct is present, even if the execution is not always as flawless, because yes, she is the star of the film in the most traditional sense, and yes, she earns that. Lopez as Aurora, as Ingrid, as the Spider Woman, is exactly the kind of overwhelming screen presence this material needs. She does not just show up and sing well, she understands the mechanics of glamorous myth. She knows how to enter a frame as if the frame belongs to her. She knows how to let the costume, the pose, the voice, and the lighting all work in sync to create a woman who exists first as fantasy and only second as person. That is not an easy thing to pull off in a movie where fantasy is itself being dissected, desired, and weaponized. But Lopez gets it. She is not just playing a diva. She is playing the emotional architecture of Molina's desire. This is not really about whether every song is instantly unforgettable. Some are not. That is almost beside the point. What matters is that the musical sequences feel like they carry the voltage the prison scenes need. They are lush, theatrical, feverish, and gloriously heightened in a way that justifies their existence beyond pure entertainment. Condon knows how to shoot a fantasy so that it glitters and threatens at the same time. Lopez, in turn, knows how to embody a dream that is powerful precisely because it cannot last. That combination makes her impossible to ignore. And yet the movie would not work if it were only her. The real emotional labor is being done by Tonatiuh and Diego Luna. Tonatiuh especially feels like the film's great discovery. He brings Molina warmth, fragility, resilience, humor, and yearning without reducing him to a type. That is a very delicate performance. Melina has to be optimistic without seeming foolish, vulnerable without becoming passive, and theatrical without turning into parody. Tonatiuh manages it. He gives Melina an emotional transparency that keeps the fantasy material grounded even when the visual world becomes huge. You believe that this man needs beauty in order to survive. And once you believe that, the whole movie gets stronger. Diego Luna is doing a very different kind of work. His Valentine begins hard-edged, defensive, and emotionally shut down. He is almost rigid with purpose. But Luna is smart enough not to make him one note. There is hurt under the discipline, tenderness under the caution, and eventually a growing need for the very story he once dismissed. That progression is one of the most satisfying parts of the film because it feels earned. Valentine does not suddenly become sentimental. He becomes reachable. He realizes that ideological clarity is not enough to keep a person spiritually intact. Luna plays that transition with real control. The chemistry between Luna and Tonatiuh is ultimately what gives the movie its heart. Even when some of the prison material feels a little too neatly shaped, or when certain subplots do not carry the same urgency as the central dynamic, the relationship between these two men is strong enough to keep the film emotionally alive. Their differences are the point, but so is the way those differences dissolve into recognition. They become, in a sense, each other's audience. Melina learns that fantasy can do more than console. It can connect. Valentine learns that fantasy is not the opposite of political truth. Sometimes it is the only language through which the truth can be endured. It also explains why the film's best scenes tend to be the ones where the two modes, prison realism and musical fantasy, stop competing and start feeding each other directly. Not every piece of the film works equally well. The opening stretch is a little shaky, partly because the movie is still negotiating its own rhythm. Some of the non-musical material can feel comparatively flat next to the ecstatic sweep of the fantasy sequences, which creates an imbalance the film never fully eliminates. There are moments when the prison drama needs more rawness, more unpredictability, or simply more pressure to match the intensity of what Lopez is doing in the musical world. And yes, there are sections that run a bit long, but even there, the film never loses its central emotional argument, and that is why it survives its weaker beats, because the argument is compelling. Fantasy is not denial. Fantasy is not weakness. Fantasy is not a distraction from reality. Fantasy is sometimes the only way reality can be faced without being spiritually annihilating. That is what Kiss of the Spider-Woman understands, and that is why its biggest musical moments do not feel like indulgence. They feel necessary. They give shape to longing. They let beauty interrupt brutality without pretending brutality is gone. That is a very hard tonal balance to strike, and even if the film is not perfect, it gets close often enough to be genuinely moving. It also helps that Bill Condon simply knows this strand. He is drawn to characters caught between performance and truth, between what the world demands and what the self needs. Here, that obsession pays off. The film is at its most potent when it lets the prison and the fantasy contaminate each other. When the songs begin carrying political and emotional residue, and when the cell itself becomes impossible to imagine without the dream world Melina keeps projecting into it, not because it is the best musical ever made, not because every scene is equally strong, but because its strongest scenes understand exactly what they are doing and why. So where do I land on Kiss of the Spider-Woman? I think it is an uneven but often electric movie musical anchored by 3 excellent performances and one very smart central idea. Jennifer Lopez gets a showcase worthy of her charisma. Tonatiuh brings the soul. Diego Luna brings the gravity. And Bill Condon, even when he does not fully balance every element, still knows how to make spectacle feel emotionally useful instead of merely impressive. And if the film invites us into fantasy, it does not do so to help us escape the truth. It does so to remind us that sometimes beauty is the only force strong enough to keep the Truth from crushing us entirely, that is a movie worth caring about. So now, I want to know what you think. Does Kiss of the Spider-Woman work best for you as a prison drama, invaded by musical fantasy, or as a musical fantasy constantly threatened by the prison reality around it? Is Jennifer Lopez the headline performance here, or does Tonatiuh end up being the real soul of the whole film once the glamour clears? That is the real tension, and it is exactly why this movie stays with you. See you in the next one.